All right, everybody. I am coming to you deep within the, gosh darn it, deep within the Corona bunker at my top secret evil lair hidden in the bowels of an active volcano. So I'm submitting these videos from hiding. Hope everybody's doing all right. We are going to talk today about natural hazards, how to plan for them, how to mitigate some of the challenges they create, reduce impacts, reduce vulnerabilities, and hopefully make our communities more sustainable through better planning for disaster response and recovery. So the video here, it's linked in the module on Canvas. It's a program in Kentucky that actually focuses on helping communities develop projects to reduce vulnerability, focusing on flood planning, and some projects there that have been funded to reduce the threat from flooding. Interesting, worth a few minutes of your time to watch that. So the activity for this lecture, there's a JPEG map of the United States attached in the module. So I'd like for you to draw on that map where various hazards around the country happen. So think about, like, where do tornadoes usually occur? Where do we see a lot of flooding? Where do we see hurricanes? Those kinds of things. Draw those on the map. Take a picture of it and upload that picture to Canvas, or email it to me if you don't have Canvas access or whatever. So that's the activity. Map's on there. If you have issues with that, certainly shoot me an email and we'll go from there. So there's two realms of hazards planning. One is mitigation. That happens kind of before storms or other hazards occur. So it's working to reduce the risk from potential hazards. So think things like, in earthquake-prone areas, you might require earthquake construction techniques, right? You might require, in tornado areas, things like requiring safe rooms to be built into commercial buildings or schools or those kinds of things, right? Those activities that can reduce the risk before a disaster happens. You want to plan development to not add to potential hazards, so think about things like floodplain regulations, so you're not building in floodplains, stormwater management policies so that new development doesn't increase stormwater runoff and flooding downstream. Things like that are the policies you put in place to not add to potential hazards. And you want to certainly have a response to hazards. So making sure you have adequate equipment stockpiled, you have evacuation routes identified so people know where to go in the event they need to evacuate. You've got proper supplies stored up that you can access to help people in the event of a disaster, those kinds of things. And then resilience planning is really about recovery from hazards. So the long-term rebuilding and recovery after a disaster happens, but it's also really thinking about long-term change in the community to better manage hazards and reduce vulnerability. So it's about thinking differently about natural hazards and building our communities in such a way that the impact of future disasters will be mitigated. It'll be less, and we have a more robust recovery process in place to recover when disasters do happen. So those are kind of the two things we're going to focus on as we go through today's lecture. So disaster happens, what comes next? Typically the reaction is driven by emergency managers and local governments, and urban planners are certainly involved in that as well. Some of the planning, of course, happens before in terms of stockpiling equipment, training emergency response personnel to respond appropriately, and so forth. Some disasters you can kind of plan for, like hurricanes. We typically, we know there's a hurricane season from June 1st to October 31st. So we kind of know when we'll see most hurricanes occur. Typically we'll see hurricanes, well in advance, and have, several days or more to kind of prepare for that. And so in that time period, emergency managers will start issuing evacuation orders, shelter orders. They'll start moving equipment and kind of staging response teams so that once the hurricane moves through, they can very quickly respond. Other disasters like earthquakes, tornadoes, things like that are much more sudden. And so there's no real way to prepare for them in advance. So you need to kind of just always be prepared and ready to respond when necessary. But there's 3 stages of reaction. The response is that immediate jump into action, save people, evacuate people, and so forth. Assessment takes place once the disaster has passed, figuring how much damage has been done, what needs to be done to recover, and then the recovery process is typically a much longer term effort to rebuild and readapt. So stage 1 of the reaction process is that response, so it's evacuation when you can do that. So again, with things like hurricanes, some flooding, right? We have, here in the upper Midwest, we certainly have flood season in the spring, and we can oftentimes predict how bad those are going to be, start to move people out of harm's way before the floods actually hit. Other places like Texas, where it's flash flood alley, those flash floods come on very quickly, and so it's harder to evacuate ahead of time. But that's the first level is getting people out of harm's way, and then as soon as possible after the disaster hits, moving into the affected areas, rescuing people in need of rescue, people that may be trapped in their homes or didn't evacuate when they were supposed to, or those who cannot evacuate, as we saw in Katrina back in 2005. A significant percentage of the population in New Orleans either didn't have a car or a reliable car, didn't have the money to pay for gas to evacuate, and so people were trapped in the city because they just financially or physically couldn't leave. And so you want to make sure those people have the services they require, have a safe place to go, or that they're picked up if they need to be. You want to maintain public order. That's certainly a part of the response process. Make sure there's not looting, make sure people are protected and kept safe. You don't have any sort of riots or other issues happening, and dealing with evacuees. And that can oftentimes happen hundreds of miles from where the disaster happens. Certainly in Texas, when people evacuate from hurricanes moving into the Gulf Coast, they'll come, all the way up to Austin, which is a couple hundred miles from the coast. And so cities far away from the disaster area oftentimes are called upon to deal with these disasters because that's where the evacuees are going. So they have to be prepared with shelters, with necessary medicines, food supplies, all of those things to deal with this sudden population of evacuees moving into their cities. So it takes coordination across a much larger area than just the immediate area of the disaster. And so that's planning, again, that needs to kind of happen in advance so that when people are evacuating, they know where to go. You can tell people, okay, leave Corpus Christi, which is a city right on the coast of Texas. There's an evacuation center set up in the Austin Convention Center. So if you get to Austin, you'll have a safe place to stay. You'll be provided for with medical care, food, all of those things that you'll need. So people have a destination in mind and they just don't start driving, hoping to find somewhere that'll take them in. So that planning needs to happen before the disaster. The assessment, again, there's a video worth clicking on there. It's about how Waffle House is actually used as an assessment tool by FEMA. So y'all up north here don't have Waffle Houses, which is a tragedy in its own right. But Waffle House is notorious for staying open during disasters. And so FEMA actually uses how much open a Waffle House is as an assessment tool. So if a Waffle House is open with a full menu, then the disaster wasn't so bad. If it's open with a partial menu, then it was pretty bad. And God forbid if Waffle House closes, it's a shitstorm. So just as a heads up with this coronavirus thing, Waffle House is closed, I think all of its locations. So that will give you a hint of just how bad coronavirus is. That's never happened before ever in the history of Waffle Houses. So it's a real mess out there, kids. So stay inside, stay with your family, stay safe. But the reaction process, the assessment process, is about determining the scope and scale of damage. So this is engineers, public safety officials, those kinds of folks going into the affected areas, looking at like structural damage to buildings and infrastructure, assessing the damage that was done to water, wastewater infrastructure, power lines, other necessary infrastructure like wastewater treatment plants, water treatment plants, electrical generation stations, power plants. All of those things are part of this assessment to really understand what work needs to be done to bring things back up to functioning and allow people to come back in and be safe and coming back to their homes. And you want to determine resources and assets for rebuilding. So what do we need to get back on our feet, get our community functioning again? And there's a couple different levels of disaster declarations. They can happen at the local level. So cities will sometimes declare disaster declarations for localized events. States and counties, sorry, that's my niece's dog barking upstairs, will issue disaster declarations. And when those disaster declarations are announced, that opens up kind of new sources of funding that become available in response to an immediate threat. And then at the national level as well, the president can declare a disaster, and that allows FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, to move in with its resources, its supplies, its expertise, and help cities and states. But it has to come from the local up, and that was one of the breakdowns in Katrina back in 2005. There was significant failures at the city and state level in declaring disaster emergencies, mobilizing resources, calling in the federal government. So, George Bush gets a lot of blame for the poor federal response to Katrina, and there were certainly some failures, but there was also significant failures at the local and state level prior to FEMA ever getting involved that delayed federal involvement and made it more difficult for the federal government to step in. So that's one of the challenges with our system, is that we have divided government. We have, local and state control that can make it sometimes a little more bureaucratic and a little more challenging to respond to these hazards. And we've seen some of that with coronavirus response as well, where there's been sort of miscommunications and failures at the state and local levels, contributing to failures at the federal level, kind of in a mishmash of responses to the disaster. So stage 3 is the recovery process. This is a long-term effort. Recovery can take years and years in response to a storm. I mean, if you look at New Orleans, the population of New Orleans still has not recovered to pre-Katrina levels. So the city is smaller than it was before Katrina because so many people left, and many of those folks, once they were gone, chose not to come back. In some cases, it's because they couldn't. Their homes were flooded out. The homes were demolished because they were just too damaged to recover, and the folks didn't have the insurance or the money to rebuild, and so they didn't have a home to come back to in New Orleans, so they stayed and made a new life wherever they evacuated to. So that certainly can happen in the event of a disaster. But recovery involves rebuilding, so fixing the things that are broken when possible, replacing things that can't be rebuilt or rehabilitated, retrofitting to reduce future damage. So looking at how, where, and why we're building places to ensure that if we rebuild, we're not going to see damage again from the same kind of storm. This happens a lot in communities that deal with regular flooding. So, flood comes through, wipes out some homes. Instead of rebuilding those homes in that flood-prone area, communities now will buy out those properties from the homeowners and relocate those homeowners to a safer place. That's what that video, the first video, the intro video, talks about, is a program to actually relocate flood-prone properties, or not the properties, but relocate the owners from those flood-prone properties, buy them out, take down the homes and buildings, leave that as open space as a place for future flooding to leave the open space as somewhere for floodwaters to go to absorb some of that floodwaters in the future. It may also include, like in coastal areas, it may include elevating buildings and homes. So putting them up on stilts so that they're above the reach of floodwaters. So when future storms happen, those homes are protected from the flooding that can occur. It also tends to involve economic restructuring. So utilizing the attention and resources that come from a disaster to foster new directions and opportunities in development. So oftentimes you'll see communities start to invest in more green energy, or look to diversify their economy so they're not so dependent on one business that gets damaged in a storm, right? So there's opportunities to take advantage. I mean, it sounds kind of terrible, but you can take advantage of these disasters and really chart a new path for your community going forward. So it's something that's important to think about and plan for. So in the event of a disaster, you're prepared to recover in a meaningful way. So some of the hazards facing our region, we have flooding, of course. Certainly in the springtime, the Mississippi River, the St. Croix, the Kinney can all flood. We have wildfire, not quite as much here as in other places, of course. I mean, you hear about the fires in California and Australia, places like that. There's significantly more threat from wildfires in those areas, but it's certainly a potential threat in some of our communities, particularly in some of the more northern rural towns that have more forest around them than we do here. Tornadoes are certainly an issue. We had one here near River Falls, year before last or last year. Blizzards and ice and heat waves are a growing concern, particularly as it relates to climate change. We're seeing warmer temperatures and spikes of warm temperatures in the summertime that can affect people pretty negatively. So flooding, a couple different types of flooding that we need to think about. Stream and river flooding is when obviously there's more water moving into a stream or a river than the capacity of the river to handle, and the water rises up, floods the adjoining floodplains, creates problems. We also have drainage caused flooding. We've talked a lot about that, how impervious surfaces in urban development lead to more stormwater runoff, which leads to flooding. So it's not streams overtopping their banks, it's just water falling from the sky that has nowhere to go. Ends up running into buildings, creating problems, flooding basements, those kinds of things. And we have coastal and tidal flooding, which is exacerbated by rising sea levels. So you see that, the video from the last lecture on coastal hazards from Miami, right? And the king tide issue they're dealing with in Miami. And a lot of this flooding, again, is impacted by urban growth. We're increasing the impervious surfaces, which leads to more runoff, which leads to more water getting dumped into streams and rivers, which contributes to stream and river flooding in addition to just stormwater flooding. We also have development that can block natural drainage paths. So as we're building new stuff, oftentimes we're building it where water used to flow, and so now that water has to go somewhere else. And so the new development can actually contribute to flooding in areas that hadn't experienced flooding before, because that development is moving the water somewhere different. And development in flood-prone areas. So this happens pretty regularly, where cities will either allow development in floodplains, or floodplains change over time. As again, we're increasing impervious surfaces, putting more water into these waterways, the floodplains will increase in size. And so development that wasn't in the floodplain 20 years ago may be in the floodplain now because of changes in topography and drainage. So these are kind of moving targets and challenges that cities have to face. And so making sure that cities have proper regulations to minimize development in floodplains and other flood-prone areas is certainly a priority for sustainable development. Oops, sorry, wrong way. So what do you do about this? One, you ensure adequate drainage facilities. You make sure that new development is not going to contribute to increased stormwater flooding, that it's going to manage any new stormwater that it creates on site and allows that water to percolate into the soil or be released more slowly into adjoining waterways through stormwater facilities, low impact development standards, all of those things. Prohibiting development in floodplains is certainly just a basic requirement that all cities should follow, and pretty much all cities do. It's pretty rare that a city would knowingly allow development in floodplains. Your low impact development standards, we've talked about that, right? That's those facilities that use sort of natural features to help mitigate stormwater and keep it on site. So proper monitoring to ensure adequate warning to residents. This is particularly useful in places like Central Texas that have flash floods, where water can rise very quickly and become a threat very quickly. So making sure that you have ways to let residents know that water's rising, that you have low water crossings properly marked. What they've done in parts of Austin now at many of the low water crossings is they've actually installed automatic gates that sense when the water is rising and will automatically close the gates, basically works like a railroad crossing. So instead of having to send out a police officer or fire truck or something like that, a person to go out there and either block the road with their car or put down gates if there are gates. These are automatic that will lower when the water rises, and it's just a way to ensure that people don't drive into flooded roadways, because it only takes like 6 inches of water to float your car and create havoc. So people think like, oh, I can drive through it, it's not that deep, but fast moving water can push your car off the road even if it's not very deep. So you have to be really careful when driving into flooded roadways. So, and then you want to plan and prepare for evacuation. So, it's particularly in areas where flooding is a regular occurrence. You want to make sure that people know how to, or know where to go in the event of a flood, and that you have a way to communicate with them to let them know they need to evacuate. So, the videos here is talking about resiliency planning, so how you can actually reduce the vulnerability to floods. So here in Wisconsin, we have the Coastal Communities Working Group, and you can look down here and they talk about some of the potential risks from flooding in the coastal communities here in Wisconsin, the ones on the Great Lakes. So they talk about coastal flooding and coastal erosion as being the potential risks in those areas. Vulnerabilities, talk about structures and property that are vulnerable to erosion and flooding, harbors and marinas that may be susceptible to water, industrial facilities, other infrastructure, roads, drainage, those kinds of things. Natural plant communities, including coastal wetlands. So as water rises and falls, it can affect those wetland areas, water intakes for community water sources. All of those things are potential vulnerabilities that these communities have based on coastal changes. They have data needs. So what is the information they need to inform the decision-making process and make sure that the decisions they're making are in line with what they're actually seeing on the ground? So things like erosion rates, parcel data, lake bed downcutting, lake bed erosion, long-term patterns of lake levels and potential lake levels moving forward. So projecting out what the lake levels might look like going forward. All of that's going to help inform the decision-making process for strategies to mitigate the vulnerabilities to increased changes in lake levels. And then there's some adaptation strategies. So again, these are strategies that can be adopted by lakeshore property owners, communities, cities, towns, counties, and so forth to help mitigate the threat. So things like development setbacks, relocating structures, education, best management practices for site design to control stormwater runoff, improving bluff stability, improving natural source protection, so beaches, dunes, wetlands, those kinds of things, and improving infrastructure. So all of those things are ways that Wisconsin is addressing some of these threats in our coastal counties, and things to consider in planning for reducing vulnerabilities. So retrofitting properties, this is an example from New York City, where after Hurricane Sandy hit the city, one of the things that they've decided to do in New York City is increase the resilience of the shoreline to mitigate future storms. And so what they've designed here in Queens on the shoreline is actually a park that that serves as open space, but also serves as a more naturalistic way to deal with high water and waves and stuff coming from storms. So instead of just building, trying to build a big seawall that would be unattractive, that would divide people from the waterfront, they turned the waterfront into an asset and into open space. And the design of this open space is such is that when there's a storm, right, this design can absorb a lot of the water that would otherwise flow into the city and flood infrastructure, flood buildings, and so forth. The park actually serves kind of as a big wetland to buffer the city from those storms. So instead of just designing a big infrastructure project of a giant wall, they're actually using a more naturalistic approach that's more sustainable. So again, just a way that one city is trying to be more resilient going forward. And you want to look at your development regulations, and again, keep development out of flood-prone areas. So this is Houston, and in Houston, they've dealt with storms, dealt with hurricanes, dealt with flooding for a long, long time. And one of the ways that they actually, or some infrastructure that they built to try and address flooding were these giant reservoirs that would serve basically to capture stormwater. But what they've done over the years since those developments were built is they've allowed people to build housing into those reservoirs. So they're dry, 99% of the time, but in the event of a massive storm like happened with Harvey a couple years ago, that's where the water is supposed to go. And so by allowing people to build homes in those neighborhoods, all of a sudden these homes are in the floodplain. And so you can kind of see here the changes over time as the water was captured, built up in the reservoirs, again, to reduce flooding downstream. So these reservoirs are intended to protect the city of Houston. And so the water collects here, and then it gets released slowly through the Buffalo Bayou, through Houston, out to the Gulf. And what happened was, because the intensity of the rain from Harvey, these reservoirs filled up and began to flood properties that shouldn't have been built where they were built. And the Corps of Engineers that manages these flood facilities were basically shit out of luck, because it was either we allow these properties to flood that had been built, basically adjoining or in the reservoirs, or we, flood Houston even more than it was already flooded. And so, that basically they sacrifice these people's homes to reduce the impact on Houston, which is, unfortunate for everybody. But it's those decisions that have to get made when you build in the wrong spot and when you allow development to occur in areas where you shouldn't be building. And you can utilize your floodways and drainage areas as urban space amenities, as green space. So again, here in River Falls, we have, as I've talked about before, the big drainage basin there in Hoffman Park, which is just a big field kids can run around, play in. You can sled on the slopes in the wintertime. There's the soccer fields over on the east side of 63, just past or just before Division Street. They play soccer there when it's dry, and it's a flood area when it's wet. So, certainly a dual use area that is nice for the community to have, but allows for that extra water to have somewhere to go. So wildfires, we're seeing more development in what's called the wildland interface. That's that area where basically, we see kind of sprawling ex-urban development on the hinterlands. Oftentimes these communities, these neighborhoods that are built on the wildland interface are pretty remote. They're isolated, they're hard to get to. They don't necessarily have adequate water infrastructure for firefighting. So people, may have a well to serve their home, but there's no, there's no fire hydrants or centralized water to provide for firefighting. So if there is a fire out there, the water has to come from basically the trucks driving in with water on the trucks. So certainly a problem as our population grows, as we grow into more rural areas and spread out more, it's becoming a greater challenge. This picture here is from a huge fire in central Texas, an area that hadn't really been known for wildfires, but there was a prolonged drought back in 2011. a summer of really scorching temperatures, and so Labor Day weekend we had a massive wildfire, killed a few people, burned thousands of acres, destroyed hundreds of homes, and was just a huge issue in Central Texas, and certainly we've seen the stories from California 2 years ago, last year, and Australia from earlier this year. Certainly some enormous challenges from wildfire. And the consequences as we develop into these areas is we are more vulnerable to wildfire. Oftentimes these rural areas have limited firefighting capacity. So it's typically volunteer fire departments. They don't have the big tanker trucks with enough water to fight these big fires. And so there's limited opportunity to intervene when these fires break out. So the video here is about FireWise regulations. This is a way for cities or communities to design their sites in a way that reduces the vulnerability to wildfires. So, looking at things like the building materials used on the homes, the landscaping in proximity to the homes, those kinds of things can have an enormous impact on how vulnerable a home is to wildfire. And so it's worth watching just to kind of understand what those regulations are about. You want to think about evacuation planning. This is, again, a picture from Texas. This is actually my parents' old neighborhood, Steiner Ranch. That same weekend of the huge fire in Bastrop that I just showed you the picture of, this one, there was a wildfire in Steiner Ranch just outside of Austin. And Steiner Ranch is a community with about 15,000 homes in it, and there's only 2 roads that lead in and out of it, and both of those roads actually come to this same collector road. And so as people were trying to evacuate from Steiner Ranch, you basically ended up with the mother of all traffic jams, because all of the cars from those 20,000 homes or 15,000 homes were all going out to the same road. And so people were literally stuck in traffic. Thankfully, no one died, but it could have been really disastrous had the fire been worse and people trapped in their cars in this traffic jam actually been killed. And that actually happened in some places in California with the big fires they had there a couple years ago or last year, where people were trapped in their cars trying to evacuate from these rural communities down, there's one way in, one way out, and people were trapped in their cars and killed. So it can be an enormous challenge to get people out of harm's way from some of these neighborhoods. And when you have this kind of traffic trying to come out, you can imagine for the emergency service workers trying to get in, the fire trucks and so forth, trying to get in to deal with the fire, it can be really hard to get in. So again, these are issues that need to be thought out prior to a disaster happening to make sure that you have plans in place to get people out safely and get the emergency workers in so they can deal with the disaster. Making sure you have proper facilities and staffing, and things like tree trimming, brush control, vacant lot maintenance can have an enormous impact because you're reducing the fuel load for potential fires. So making sure that you have policies in place to control brush, do brush clearing on vacant land, to make sure that your forests do controlled burning when it's appropriate to clear out some of the fuel loads, do brush clearing, those kinds of things to make sure that you don't have increased fuel loads to cause challenges when fires do break out. And when we talk about resilience planning in terms of wildfires, you want to look at your development regulations. So minimize development in areas that are vulnerable to fires, put in place those FireWise regulations to make sure that homes being built in the wildland interface are designed to be less vulnerable to fires. It really can make an enormous difference in preserving property when you have FireWise regulations in place, and it saves your resources from trying to go out and save every home. If you have those FireWise standards in place, you can kind of know those homes are as protected as they can be, and we can use that fire truck to go to a more vulnerable area. And you want to make sure that you have your evacuation routes and facilities in place so people can get out of harm's way and they have somewhere to go when they need to get out of harm's way. So tornadoes, we don't think of them often as an urban hazard, but they certainly are. This is a building in Fort Worth, Texas, in the middle of downtown they got whacked by a tornado, and you can see the damage that it did to that building. They ended up actually demoing this building and building something else in its place because it was so damaged. But again, right in the middle of a city, something we don't typically expect. Okay, that's worth showing because it's kind of funny. Okay, we are in Wisconsin. We are not really in the middle of Tornado Alley, but we certainly are close. We did have Wisconsin tornadoes here in Wisconsin a couple years ago. 16 tornadoes confirmed. Golly, all these stupid pop-ups. So this was from, when was this story? 2018. Right before classes started, a line of thunderstorms moved through and did some significant damage across different counties here in Wisconsin. So certainly something we need to deal with. Also flash flood watch. So these things oftentimes go together where you're not dealing with just one hazard, you're dealing with multiple hazards. So always something we need to think about. So there's not a lot you can do for tornadoes. I mean, they certainly are, we know kind of the areas where we'll see tornadoes. We know the areas that are most vulnerable to tornadoes, but it's not like flooding or hurricanes where you have, you sometimes can have advance warning. It's just, you have a thunderstorm, you get a tornado, and it happens. So some ways to deal with the threat from tornadoes are requiring things like safe rooms and facilities, particularly in public buildings, schools and so forth, so that, in the event of a tornado, you can get people to a safe place. At the horse farm, I don't know if anybody's been out there. Some of you probably have. There is a tornado safe room in the right there in the horse farm, the place where workers and students that are there can go in the event of a disaster. Each of our buildings has a tornado response map on the walls. You can see where to go in the event of a storm and tornado. So again, just understanding where to go and how to be safe in the event of a tornado, and having warning systems in place. So making sure people can, there's sirens here in River Falls. They get tested at noon. But making sure you have ways to warn people about impending disasters. Resilience planning, identifying vulnerable areas, minimizing construction in those areas if possible. Again, tornadoes are pretty random, happen kind of all over the place, so you really can't just stop building in the Great Plains. But you want to make sure that you have adequate construction standards, safe rooms, those kinds of things, and you can utilize the disaster to refocus economic opportunities and disaster development patterns. So this video from Greensburg, Kansas is worth watching. It explains how this city in Kansas that was literally, the whole city was wiped out by a tornado. It was one of those like massive, mile-wide tornadoes that took out basically the entire city. And so this video highlights how they've used that tragedy and that disaster as a way to refocus development in their community, build resiliency, build sustainability, and become really kind of a poster child for sustainable development going forward. So again, that video will be posted in the module as well. So hurricanes as an urban hazard. Again, there's a video there you can watch talking about hurricane scales and the rating system, Force 1, force up to Force 5, or whatever we have for hurricanes. Talks about why that matters. Hurricanes are a seasonal threat, typically June 1st to October 31st. Some recent occurrences of hurricanes, right? We had Florence, Harvey, Irma, we had Matthew last year, so there's been quite a few pretty wicked storms that have come through, caused enormous damage to coastal communities. Hurricanes can also create problems more inland. So we'll see tornadoes, flooding, are two big threats associated with hurricanes for the more inland areas. So certainly not just a one-off threat to coastal communities. We see inland threats as well, and an enormous challenge for those communities to deal with. So what do we do about it, right? Same as any place else, we want to minimize development in vulnerable areas. We want to ensure that any construction in those areas is done to mitigate any potential harm. So if it's, for residences on the beach, we can elevate those, build them in a way that allows for the basically the first floor to flood without harming the entire structure, or just have it up on stilts so that the floodwaters can go underneath it without damaging the home. We want to make sure that residents have all available communication to them, so multiple ways of getting the word out to residents about evacuation orders, shelter in place, whatever it might be, to respond to the threat, and making sure we have adequate evacuation routes and management. So oftentimes the evacuation can be more dangerous than the storm itself. An example in Texas, Rita was a hurricane that happened like maybe 2 weeks after Katrina, 3 weeks after Katrina. So everybody was already on edge from the harm caused by Katrina. And so when Rita started moving towards Houston, people kind of lost their minds, and they had this massive evacuation out of the Houston area. And Houston is the fourth largest city in the country. So a lot of people on the move. There was one instance where a bus caught on fire and killed, I think, 27 or 28 elderly people that were being evacuated from a senior citizen's home. Other people were running out of gas on the roadside. It just was a hot mess. And so not having proper evacuation routes and management in place created more harm than the storm itself. So you certainly want to make sure that you have that planned out, and you have the adequate resources in place to move people to safety in mass numbers. So resilience planning, you want to think about development standards to minimize the threat from flooding and wind. So in this example here, this first floor is basically designed, these walls can break away in the event of flooding. There's nothing, of importance at this first level. So you're not going to lose, your anything but maybe storage space. So again, designed to allow the water to come in, flood through, move out without harming the home itself. Protecting your natural barriers, things like barrier islands and wetlands, are super important to mitigate the threats from hurricanes. So those are the natural buffers that we have and need to be preserved and protected as much as possible. So we need to minimize development in those areas to allow them to serve their function as buffers to storms. And again, looking for economic opportunities and redevelopment once the storm happens. So climate change is creating new challenges for communities. Here in Wisconsin, we have this, the Wisconsin Climate Change Initiative on Climate Change Impacts is the state working group to identify and mitigate the hazards we might face from climate change. And so if we click on this slideshow here, if you're interested in this, you can actually see changes over time in temperatures. So if we want to look at what annual temperatures might be like in Wisconsin going forward out to year 2055, we're looking at 4 to 9 degrees potential temperature increases by the middle of the century. You can see changes in summer and winter temperatures, so you can begin to understand the impacts this might have on, say, agriculture. Certainly with climate change, we're going to see changing temperature regimes, we're going to see changing precipitation patterns, lots of things that could have an enormous impact on the agricultural industry. We'll also see potential impacts on flooding, things like that we need to be prepared for as we move forward. So the problem with climate change is that it certainly is politicized, and it's really hard to have a meaningful conversation about climate change, because on one side of the coin you have those who think it's a hoax and that it's all made up. On the other side, basically treat it like a religion, and we're all going to die in 12 years if we don't fundamentally radically alter our entire economy to deal with climate change. So it can be really hard to have a rational conversation and to start to identify common ground where we can recognize changes are happening, recognize that we maybe can do things differently to address some of the challenges related to climate change. You can't have that rational conversation. It's all or nothing for many people. So my argument is that as planning practitioners, as people engaged on the ground with climate change and with trying to help communities prepare for the impacts of climate change, we need to focus on what's happening right now. Things like again, go back to the example from Miami, where we're seeing flooding right now from sea level rise. We're not going to fight about whether it's climate change or whatever. We're seeing flooding from sea level rise right now. What are we going to do about it? We need to think differently about how we build, how we design our neighborhoods, how we can retrofit neighborhoods that are flooding to be more resilient to that flooding. So that's efforts we need to make right now to address this issue. We're not going to get bogged down in the big political fight. We're just going to deal with what we're seeing on the ground. So again, here in Wisconsin, this working group is looking at the potential impacts. And so again, these are things that we can see on the ground. So this example here of forestries, right? We're going to see changes potentially in tree species. As we see those warming temperatures, we'll see different kinds of tree species that can thrive in those warmer temperatures. Other species that are vulnerable may die out and migrate further north. Cold water fisheries, something that's important here in River Falls with the Kenny River. And so changes in temperatures put those at risk. And so we need to think about how we're going to address that. Human health, looking at more intense and frequent storms, heat waves, those things that potentially threaten human health and safety. We need to deal with that, as well as air and water quality, Lyme disease, other pathogens that can survive in a warming climate. So again, we need these are issues that we're dealing with on the ground right now, and we need to recognize those and deal with them as community planners. So as we've kind of seen going throughout this lecture, each hazard requires different but similar actions, right? If we're going to build resiliency into our communities, we need to recognize the hazards that our communities face and reduce the vulnerabilities that we have to them. So in terms of how we build our communities, how we design our individual buildings, transportation networks, all of those things play a role in reducing vulnerability and building more sustainability into our communities. And that's really our role as planners, is to help mitigate threats and build more sustainable, more resilient communities. So just to kind of wrap things up, there's two types of planning. So there's mitigation, which is trying to minimize threats before they happen. So again, that's things like making sure we have adequate communication and evacuation routes identified, making sure we have adequate staff for emergency response, making sure we have appropriate equipment and stockpiles of supplies ready to go to respond to a disaster. And then resiliency is really about that long-term recovery and also reducing vulnerabilities, minimizing future risks from hazards our communities face. So those are really the two types of planning related to natural hazards. The 3 steps of reaction to a hazard occurrence is the response. So that's that immediately get in there, save people, move people to safety, respond exactly, maintain public order, those kinds of things. That's that immediate response. Then we have the assessment, which is about figuring out how bad it was, what damage was done to the public infrastructure, to private buildings and facilities and so forth, and what needs to get done to rebuild and return to normalcy. And then recovery is that long-term effort to rebuild necessary infrastructure and facilities, rebuild homes, rebuild the economy, but also reduce vulnerability going forward so that when another disaster strikes, the community is less susceptible to harm from it and able to bounce back quicker and recover faster. And planners bring knowledge and skills to this process. Because planners tend to have that holistic approach looking across things like engineering and public safety and architecture and all of those different elements, we have a we can take the big picture view of how best to reduce vulnerabilities, how to coordinate things like economic growth and land use and housing and transportation and all of those things. We dabble in all of those different areas, so we can bring a view that encompasses that complexity and can help to identify strategies to reduce vulnerabilities and build resilience going forward. So that's what I got for today. Have a lovely rest of your day, and please reach out if you need anything. Oops.